Okay, so this is great. We see each other. It's been a while, right? We'll go around the room and no, you don't want to go around the room and wait for you to do it over the next couple of years. You want to do that? All right, let's scratch that. This is the 7th annual. We do this every year. We did it last year, but it was virtual. So this is our 7th time getting together, and as the firm continues to expand, SmithAmundsen Business Services, Labor and Employment Services, our industry practice groups continue to expand throughout the Midwest. We really believe that it is critical to deliver content to our HR and in-house legal contacts and clients for cutting edge, what do I need to know, information on compliance and on recruiting and retaining employees. Pretty important in this day and age. We're all really important. We're like, to quote, is it Ron Burgundy? Kind of a big deal. You're kind of a big deal. You're in more demand now than I would think ever, right? We need you. Businesses need you. Organizations need you. You are needed. You're important. And somebody said something about knowledge is power. I think that's a pretty important quote. Knowledge is power. And so today's presentation, again, both buckets, compliance, recruiting, and retention, with some of our A-team partners, including Mike Wong and John Hayes, to kick things off. But before they do and get into the vaccines, because I am very curious what you're going to say, John and Mike, about this. It's going to be really clear when they're done. Couple announcements. Wi-Fi. They announced the Wi-Fi settings. It's not the right setting. It's just that Hyatt meetings, you go to Hyatt meetings, no password is needed. If you have a question about the presentation, the content, anything that comes up, please feel free to speak up. Heather Bailey's going to be walking around. There's Heather. She'll be walking around with the mic. She'll make sure. We want to mic everybody because it is being recorded, because there's going to be an on-demand recording of this that you can access, or your friends. You can give it away for holiday gifts if you want to. You have our permission. But there will be a free on-demand content through our website. Bathrooms are located outside. And we'll be taking some breaks during the presentation. I think there's a break right after the first one, right? Because everybody's got to decompress. It's a long one, okay. And then the slides will be downloaded and distributed? All right, wonderful. Or you can download them now with, that thing, the Scan Me. I guess that works too. All right, so I'm done. You guys have a lot to go over. So I'm going to shut up and welcome, everybody, welcome. Good to see all of you. Thanks for coming.
All right. Afternoon, everybody. How's everybody feeling today? So here's the big question. In the past 18 months, has anybody else been to a live presentation? How many people, this is the first one they've been to? Woo! Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. All right, jumping over to our first slide here. Oh, sorry. One more, John. So I'll be presenting this afternoon. My partner, John Hayes, will also be going through this. We're going to be jumping back and forth. You know, we have a lot to go over. And in fact, over the past few weeks, things had changed dramatically when it comes to the vaccines. I think everybody at the end of August started freaking out, and then we heard from the president, and we started freaking out even more. So number one thing I want to remind everybody is we've made it this far. We can continue to survive, and we will continue to make it. But you've heard this over the past 18 months. I don't know how many times. Is this a new normal? Quite honestly, yes. Yes. A lot of the stuff that we're dealing with now, we will be dealing with in the future, even after the pandemic status is revoked. So it is something that we are going to have to recognize and remember that. We're going to have to keep in mind how the tight labor market is impacting us, and not just that, the multiple views of employees. I can't tell you how many times I've been working with clients and we've put together an incentive vaccine program or mandatory vaccine program, and you would not believe the multitude of responses that we get from employees going both directions on a multitude of different issues. So that is something that we have to remind each other of. Now, going into the roadmap of what we are going to address today. As I like to say, how in the H-E-double-L did we get here? I'm a big fan of history, and the realistic part of it is when we look back, things in history tend to repeat themselves. So I'm going to go over a little bit about the history of the pandemic, how we've gotten to where we are, whether to mandate or not. That's a big question right now. It really got pushed forward by state governments as well as federal governments, especially Illinois. Some other state governments have gone the other direction, saying, no, we don't want to see this. So it is going to be important to look at that. We're going to look at federal, state, and local mandates. Why do we say local in this? Don't we only have to worry about federal? Absolutely not, especially when we live around Chicago and wonderful Cook County. There are certain areas we have to remember when it comes to locals. We're going to look at the employer vaccine programs. If you haven't heard about the soft mandates yet, well, guess what? We'll go over and describe what that means, as well as what the hard mandates are. Finally, if anybody's already started working on vaccine programs, or even before the vaccine program, mask programs, we had ADA implications, right? And what's come up even more now? Religious discrimination, religious views, and the exemptions under that. Those are a whole host of problems. You're gonna love us talking about that. Finally, we're gonna go over our latest CDC, OSHA, masks, social distancing, vaccines. So that's our kind of guideline for what we're gonna do today. So jumping in immediately, I hope this doesn't trigger anybody responses, but this is our background. This is what happened. So if anybody remembers March 12th, 2020, seems like 20 years ago, really only about 18 months. This is when government started shutting things down. In fact, I remember it specifically because March 13th, my kids got shut out of school and were told to go home and do remote learning. That brought on its own host of problems and issues for every parent, especially for employers and dealing with employees who were dealing with that. Then we go through the FFCRA, Emergency Paid Sick Leave, CARES Act, first wave of deaths. It spiked in April 13th, 2020. Then we go to our next phase. It seemed like we were going down. We had a good trajectory. We started spiking again, January 11th, 2021. Second wave spiked at 23,000 deaths. Now we're in September. One point I like to point out is in March 13, 2020, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, they said, we expect this to only last 18 months. Guess what? We're at 18 months this month. We are still seeing it. So that's part of parcel. We have to look back at what we've done over the past 18 months and see likely that's what we're going to have for foreseeable future. When I say at least, we should plan out, I would say almost a year in advance. Now, when we start talking about this, I have to get to vaccines. And right now, 181 million fully vaccinated, about 54%, a little over 54% of the total population. If we go to the next slide, we talk about deaths and cases. I looked these numbers up since I put this slide together. It's only been about 2 weeks. And right now, confirmed cases, we're at 42.6 million cases. We've increased about 20,000 deaths to 683,000 deaths. So the interesting part about it is when we look at this, how this disease or how this medical condition progresses. Usually there's about a 2-month lead up when cases start spiking, and then there's usually a drop off, and you see that in these charts. There's a drop off that happens usually about within a month after the cases spike up. September 13th actually was our spike for this most recent cycle. And so I expect over the next month we're going to start heading down. The question is whether holiday season is going to impact that as well. I would likely say yes, so there might be a shorter cycle. And if you look up here, typically the cycles between it is about 5 to 6 months between each spike or each cycle when it starts moving up. But now that we've looked at that, vaccines, to mandate or not to mandate? That is the question. Of course, there's tons of questions in this. And the number one thing I like to tell everybody is this is a case-by-case, company-by-company decision that has to be made. This isn't something where you can call me and say, okay, Mike, what are we doing? Unless you're covered by an actual mandate, this is completely up to the company on how to address it. So unless federal government, you fall under there, state government, you fall under there, this is something that you can decide on how you want to do it. This was a big question. When the vaccines first came out, we were all looking at this and asking, can we mandate the vaccine? You know, can we do that? And the initial response, quite honestly, was no. And the EEOC didn't do us any favors because they didn't give us a direct answer. They said, yes, you can require, and that's something that we've been able to do. For the past 20 plus years, we've been able to mandate vaccines for flu, for other conditions. However, in order to do that, we had to have a business reason. We had to have it had to be related to the person's job. And so pretty much the only industry that was able to mandate vaccines was the healthcare industry. The healthcare industry had the basis because they were the front line. They were the ones who were dealing with those conditions on a frontline basis. They could legitimately make it a safety issue. Well, guess what? Now, with the pandemic, that's changed. In fact, it's something where we're starting to see more and more companies across different industries, not just in the healthcare industry, in fact, the legal industry, the entertainment industry. We're starting to see some of the bigger box stores, Walmart, TJ Maxx, Saks, CVS, Walgreens, McDonald's, Ford, Disney, NBC, CBS. All of these companies have started to put into place some sort of vaccine policy, whether it's required, a hard requirement, or a soft requirement. They're starting to put those into place. So what does that mean for you? Well, I like to say that makes it a lot easier for you that some of the bigger companies and some of the big leaders in some industries have started to take this step. Exact same thing when we started dealing with face masks. Did we really want to be the first one to say you have to wear a face mask to come into our store? Not really. But once the big box stores, once bigger companies started mandating it, it made it easier because it wasn't just us doing it. As I like to say, it's the kind of the peer pressure, the herd mentality issue. When we talk about this, what are the questions, though, we have to ask? You know, is this going to give us a competitive advantage or hurt us? Believe it or not, in some industries and some groups, it is a bonus for applicants to see that the company is taking advantage of this and implementing some sort of vaccine policy. Does that work for every industry, for every company, for every applicant? Absolutely not. Will it lower costs or risks of work comp, sick, paid leave, and lack of workforce? Well, in my view, it has a strong correlation because if you have everybody who's vaccinated, there's a less chance of them having to go out. And we still all remember that when it was made clear that if somebody gets COVID and they're working in person at the facility, that could be a work comp claim for you. So there's absolutely risk there. So it is a consideration. In fact, with having making it so difficult to get a workforce, it's important for us to keep that workforce in place and able to work. And if we have a spike, if we have an outbreak, that could hurt that. Will a mandate scare away applicants? I think, you know, because of the differing views on this, absolutely, if we make that clear, it's going to narrow down our pool, so it is something we have to consider. Will it mandate some employees to leave? I think probably if any of you have one in place, you've maybe seen that already. And I'm surprised at it, but I see it too. And so we have to be very careful. We have to make sure we make clear the possible exemptions for them, whether if it's a disability, if it's a religious view that they have, that we are going to accommodate that. We are going to make a way for them to continue to work. Will it impact employee morale? I've seen it both ways. I've seen it positively impact a number of employees as well as negatively impact. In fact, for one client, we were working through an incentive program where we had a drive of providing information. We had one employee say, I'm sick and tired of getting this information. It's like, okay, well, we're just providing this information from the CDC. We're not forcing it down your throat. What are the safety concerns of not having a mandate? There are ones. I just kind of talked about them a little bit. Does that mean you have to mandate it? Absolutely not. I think it would help if you don't mandate to at least find out who in your company are not mandated or who have not gotten vaccinated. That's going to be helpful in the long run in addressing these issues. So now we get into what's the basic mandate guidelines. Under the ADA, mandatory vaccine programs must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. As I said before this came about the only industry you could really qualify that under was the healthcare industry, and even the healthcare industry faced lawsuits over it. There was a number of lawsuits. Courts came down, said no, this is something that's directly related to working in the healthcare industry, especially when you're patient-facing. However, where we are now, the current verbiage from the federal government, especially with President Biden's announcement on the pathways to out of the pandemic, as well as state of Illinois' indications on mandates and with regards to it, and the surge of the Delta variant, can almost any employer meet this standard? I would say yes. I would say it's a very low standard at this point. Now, we have to keep that in mind for, and I like to say, when we eventually do get out of the pandemic, because we will. At some point, the pandemic status will be revoked, and it will be something where we will have to revisit some of these. So it's not something we can set it in place like the flu vaccine and require it indefinitely, but it is something that we can pay attention to. So, as you heard me, it's still a case-by-case basis. You have to look at it and say, okay, what's the potential risk? And it may be something where you look at your employees and you mandate it for certain employees in a certain class that are client-facing, and for those who are not client-facing, you don't. So it is something where you can modify it and change it within your own company. Exceptions. This is a huge thing that we're going to be talking about later. We know there's going to be a ton of questions. There does have to be exceptions under the ADA as well as Title VII. So Title VII is related to religious exemptions. We're going to be talking about that. Time off. Paid. Should it be given for employees to get vaccinated or have possible side effects? We're going to see that. In fact, it's mandatory in the healthcare industry under the ETS, Emergency Temporary Statute from OSHA. And the ETS is something that we're going to be, or standards that we're going to be talking about that are going to apply to all employers. That's a scary thing because a lot of you, how many of you are in an industry where you typically don't deal with OSHA? Yeah. Guess what? Primarily it's looking at workplace safety. So are there machines that could injure somebody? Is somebody using a forklift? But now it's going to be targeting and looking at just office workers as well. Employees that we haven't traditionally viewed it. So those are going to be issues. Limited inquiries on whether vaccinated or not. What am I talking about that? You heard me say, I recommend. I think it's a good idea to find out for yourself how many of your employees are vaccinated, how many are not. However, in asking that question, you want to be very limited in it. It's a yes or no question. Have you been vaccinated? And if they have not been vaccinated, do you want to ask why? Absolutely not. Why? We get into the ADA. That's asking for medical information. It's nuanced. It's kind of a pain, but we have to be careful about that. We have to recognize the EEOC has said, yes, you can ask whether somebody's vaccinated or not, but we can't inquire and go deeper into why they haven't been vaccinated. Whether that's a personal choice, whether that's based on religion, whether it's based on a medical condition. We can't ask why because that's a question that could bring about medical information.
Mike, we have a question.
Yeah.
How do you recommend we answer the question when somebody says to you, you're violating my privacy rights by asking me if I'm vaccinated? I actually just had this morning too.
Absolutely. And what I do is I have the website to the EEOC guidance that specifically states it is not a privacy violation. It is not an issue. It is an absolute question that we can ask. I would explain to them that it's not only a question that we're allowed to ask by EEOC standards, but due to OSHA and our requirement to keep employees safe, that we feel this is a step that we need to take as a company to ensure the safety of our employees. So that's a great question, but that kind of tells you the divergence. And I can't tell you how many times I've kind of chuckled and laughed to myself because of the viral videos of people walking into a restaurant saying, well, I've got a religious exemption. I got my religious beliefs. You can't violate my rights. It's like, well, you're absolutely right. You have your religious beliefs, And if you want to stand outside and I can have somebody provide you service out there, we can, but we don't have to let you come in. And that's kind of with the vaccine at a certain point where we are going to be. And there's questions that we're going to have to face on what if an employee provides us false information? What if an employee refuses to answer whether they've been vaccinated or not? And some of that will depend on your policy, we'll kind of talk about those issues a little bit later, but absolutely, if you have a policy on a vaccine mandate or those questions, you can say, no, we are entitled to ask these questions, and if you refuse to answer, it'd be the same as you refusing to cooperate on a job or a task that we've asked you to do, and could result in discipline up to and including termination. And so that usually, and you say, if you feel that you have an exemption, we are an EEO employer, we do provide accommodations for disability and religious beliefs. If you have that, we have our wonderful form here for you to fill out and explain why you are not vaccinated. So we try to avoid the confrontation by making clear to them, hey, no, this is the law. And that, in fact, I had one situation at the beginning of the pandemic where we started getting the little flyers saying, this is a DOJ violation, you'll be subject to all of this. And it was amazing that it took the Department of Justice so long to come out saying that was fraudulent. But they finally did. And so that then, we had a whole, bullet point on how to address that with people when they came in with that documentation, because that's scary. And if your rank and file employees don't know that, if they're the ones asking the questions, it's harder for them. And that's why at the beginning of this, we stressed training. Make sure your employees understand how to address that if they're going to be the first contact. All right, so that gets us to our next slide. If we're going to develop a policy, if we're going to develop a mandate, a policy, it needs to be clear. We need to set, if we're going to require vaccine, we need to set clear, achievable end dates. What do we mean by that? Well, if anybody's been subject to the governor's mandate on vaccines, it's a soft mandate. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But he literally came out and said in 2 weeks, everybody has to have their first shot. Was that an achievable result? Was that something that was really going to happen? No, not really. And that's why he came out 2 weeks later with an extension, giving an additional 2 weeks. So I look at it as for initial shot, giving somebody 30 days, likely a reasonable amount of time. Then you have to count out from that on how much time you need to provide somebody to get the second shot if they are taking one of the vaccines with 2 shots. So approximate month for the first, and then maybe additional 45 days to be fully vaccinated. The other part there is what's fully vaccinated. It's actually not at the date that they get the second shot, but it's 2 weeks after the date that they get the second shot. So calculate that in. That's why I usually say about 45 days. I've pushed that out for some clients too when we talk with them. Disciplining. You want to make clear that we will discipline. Whether, and we talk about soft mandate, hard mandate, on either of those, we have to pick a stance that we're going to take and live and die by that. I mean, we have to make sure that we are going to take a stance, because if we start making exceptions other than that required by law, that's going to trickle down that it's not a required mandate, and it's just like the bane of your existence of a supervisor or manager letting somebody get away with coming in late or attendance issues, and then the rest of the employees start complaining about it. So we have to be careful on that. I hear this all the time. Do we have to include questions or explanation on the exemptions? We absolutely do. And I think, in fact, I have, when we're talking about policies or announcements, I usually like to throw in on the very bottom line under the footer, we are an EEO employer. If you have questions or issues under an ADA or religious belief that requires an exemption, please contact. You give them who to contact. You'll hear one of the ways that I like to use that to our advantage, rather than having 20 million people contact us, is we set it up so we explain that, okay, if you get an exemption, it's just not a walk in the park. You're going to have to do X, Y, and Z, or there could be requirements of you, including additional training, additional PPE wearing, additional X, Y, Z, things that will have to be required of them in addition. You'd be surprised how many people I've heard that kind of scares off, because they suddenly realize, oh, this isn't just like I get an exemption and I can go about my daily life. There's additional things that I'll have to do. Morale should be considered. You heard me talk about it. It's a valid concern. And this is one that, again, it's a case-by-case basis. You're going to have to look at how it's going to impact your employees. In fact, getting that initial data on who's been vaccinated and who hasn't been vaccinated, especially at this point, is likely going to provide you a good understanding of what your population of employees could impact the morale. And this is something that once you find that out, it may impact how you put into place your policy or your program. For example, if it's a large portion of your employee workforce, you got to start figuring out, what if these individuals start refusing to work? How are we going to continue to manage our day-to-day? Do we have to modify what we're planning based upon that? Civil lawsuits. This is something we all fear. We do not want to get involved with civil lawsuits. Why? That wastes our time, our money. It's not something we want to get involved in. Have we seen them already? Absolutely. And this is another point when we point to a lot of the larger companies who have already started implementing them. They're usually going to be the ones who face these lawsuits, not us. These lawsuits generally have been denied by the courts at the motion to dismiss stage. That's good news, because it's not something you have to go through extended litigation, but the courts are saying, listen, based on the pandemic status, based on federal government stance, state government stance, this is something that employers are allowed to do. Unions. For all of you that have unions, yes, this is an issue of mandatory bargaining. Just like when when medical marijuana came about and we had to start working on our drug testing policies, is this an issue we had to go to them and talk about? Yes, it is. It's an issue that we have to go and talk with them as well. Even if it's not, and that I say it's safe to bet that it is. Even if it's not, if you choose not to, is it worth the goodwill that you'll get from the union to sitting down and talking with them about what you're planning? Absolutely. In fact, when we did that with marijuana, a lot of the unions, they didn't have any issue. They completely understood where we were coming from and the modifications that we're making to drug testing. Same thing here, although it is a different issue, so you do have to be careful of it. For those who are non-union status, you don't have a union workforce. Guess what? You're still subject to the National Labor Relations Act. What's that mean? That means you can still get an unfair labor practice charge filed against you by an employee who is not in the union. So again, it's an issue that we do have to be careful in how we progress on this and how your policies are implemented. If you have an employee start complaining about it, can we retaliate against them? Absolutely not. And you got to be very careful. Like the question we had over here, what if they say this is an issue? We want to spell out to them or provide them something making clear that it is not a violation of their rights. That this is allowed by the federal government and under the laws that they're claiming. Legislation banning, is this something that's occurring? We have seen lots of bills introduced throughout the United States. It keeps us busy. In fact, it's kept one of our law clerks extremely busy over the past few months trying to compile over this and keep up to date on it. So a lot of bills have been introduced. We haven't really seen any passed. There have been several states that passed legislation banning mandates by public employers. We've seen some talk about prohibiting discrimination based on vaccine status, for example, Montana, but we haven't seen any legislation be passed through prohibiting it. Could we in the future? Absolutely. Why aren't we seeing it right now? Well, with the push for vaccines also came the Delta variant. And with the Delta variant came increased safety issues. And so it became much harder for any sort of legislation like that to get passed through. If we see a decrease in numbers, which I expect we'll see over the next month, could those change? It absolutely could. So it is a hot topic. It is something that we have to be mindful of. We have to be careful of what's going on. In fact, you'll hear us talk about Cook County and City of Chicago and how they have nuanced ordinances that impact everything from even what the governor put down on his executive order. So it is something we have to pay attention for there. Now, John, he's going to talk about soft mandates, and what exactly are they?
All right, thanks, Mike. So the soft mandates, if you don't know what it is, you're going to know, one, from me telling you, but two, because of the OSHA ETS rule that's coming down
for employers that have 100 or more employees, that is going to likely be a soft mandate. So what is a soft mandate? It's where the employees are required either to be vaccinated and provide proof of that vaccination, or to be tested regularly, and usually to have some type of indoor masking or social distancing. And also you want to be prepared for your employees to provide proof of both, proof of vaccination and proof that they were tested and that they were negative. It's everything that Mike talked about in terms of the caveats for mandates apply to soft mandates. It's pretty similar in terms of the rules and regulations that are going to come along with it. You have to take into account the disability and the religious exemptions. And then there are obviously a lot of questions that come with the soft mandate. And right now, we're still just talking about if you are doing it voluntarily as the employer. So if it comes down through the OSHA ETS, which we will talk about a little bit more later, then there's going to be probably a lot more outlines and details on how you're going to do it. But the questions that are going to come up if you're thinking about implementing the soft mandate is one is who pays for the vaccination, right? Usually that's not going to be the employer's problem, especially if they're going to get it done out in the community, so CVS, Walgreens, their doctor. It's going to be free, and everyone here who has been vaccinated knows that you didn't have to pay for it. And then we will talk about some of these questions in detail later, but is getting vaccinated compensable time? What about travel expenses? Likely, if you are mandating it, probably it is going to be compensable. And then if you have travel expenses, maybe, and again, it's going to depend, and we're just not super clear right now on the answers to a lot of these things. Another question is, how are you going to administer it? Are you going to do it in-house testing, at your work site, or are you going to go out and have them go out in the community and have them go get tested that way? Same thing for testing, who pays for it? Is getting tested compensable? And then Mike touched on this issue briefly, but the fake vaccination and testing documentation. What do we do if an employee lies? If they try to forge something and say, oh yeah, here's my card, right? Or here's my doctor's note that says I was vaccinated. Here's my test. This is something that is going to come up. The federal government, in its mandate for its employees to be vaccinated, on the form, it clearly says that they are, if you lie about it or fake documentation or whatever, you're going to be subject to discipline up to termination. And they also put language in there about criminal penalties. I don't know if private employers need to do that, but it's something that you should be aware of, and that it's going to come up because you want to keep your employees safe. And if you do have other employees who are faking this, you just want to be aware that this is an issue and might come up. And similar to how do you address refusals to comply with any type of mandate, the hard mandate, soft mandate, whatnot. And as Mike said, I think the best way to do that is have a clear written policy and put in there that if you do not, comply with our policy, you will be disciplined up to termination. And the last thing on here is the disability and religious exemption requests. We will, I promise, get into this in detail later. Mike has a lot of slides on religious exemption. So we will go over that. But again, just like all other mandates, any type of policy you have regarding masks or vaccines, make sure that you are clear that you are allowing for these exemptions.
Now, before we move on from this slide, on the compensable time, you're going to hear this a lot. And there's a lot of questions when it comes to that. And what it comes down to is if an employer requires some sort of test or a vaccine, it's just kind of like drug testing. If we send somebody for drug testing, identify them as reasonable suspicion, send them to drug testing, we have to pay them for that time that they're getting drug tested. And so the question that comes up, it's a nuance with the soft mandate, is are we requiring vaccination? And is that compensable time? Because under a soft mandate, they're not required to get vaccinated. It's an option. If they choose to get vaccinated, they don't have to go through the weekly testing. Now, it's kind of the devil's in the details, and which is the worst, paying for them to get tested on a weekly basis or giving them time off to go get vaccinated. So that's a consideration I think is important. I think it's nuance in this that we could probably get away with not paying them to get vaccinated under a soft mandate, but we would have to pay for them to get tested on a weekly basis. And is that your safe thought, John?
Yeah, I would agree with that, Mike. Yeah, again, we've been saying this a lot, but at this point, really a lot of it is as clear as mud, as Jeff likes to say. I think that's the best way to look at it right now until we get some more kind of guidance and see how these things are going to progress through the courts and things like that. So better safe than sorry, I'd say. So you don't want to do a hard mandate. You don't want to do a soft mandate. Other things you can do, and this is again outside of any type of government issued mandate that you have to follow, are incentives, right? And so incentives, they're not just positive things, they can be penalties as well. So the rewards, and I've seen a lot of these, at least kind of leading up to today. I think this might change going forward as you have more government mandates. But a lot of employers, a lot of our clients are doing the reward system where you give them cash, gift cards, products like it says iPad, maybe some PTO. I've also seen raffles and lotteries. You can enter in if you're vaccinated. So this is something that a lot have been doing, and I'll talk a little bit about it more on the next slide. And then you also have penalties. So penalties are technically an incentive, but they're obviously the stick to the reward carrot, right? So you can be financial. So we'll talk about this a little bit more too, such as the health insurance surcharge. So we'll get into that. And it can be disciplinary, right? It could be, discipline, up to and including termination. So the EOC has essentially said that incentives are okay. So employers can provide these. However, there's a big asterisk there that says as long as it's not considered coercion. But what is coercion? I mean, it's not clear, but I can tell you from looking at this, kind of the main thing that the EOC is concerned about is if the employer is having like, it's going to be optional, right? Because this is an incentive program. It's an optional. If you're having an optional vaccination program at your workplace, so you're bringing in like a provider to provide these vaccines to your employees, that's where coercion could come into play. And as you can see on the slide, what they're most worried about is that, and Mike talked about this as well, like this is confidential medical information that they're providing. For anyone here who has, gone to the doctor or even gotten the vaccine, there are certain questions that they ask you before you get that shot, both times. And so that is considered confidential medical information. So if you are asking that at the work site, the EOC views that differently than if you just send, hey, you guys can go and get it at your local Walgreens or whatever. So there is a difference there. And then you can see here, unfortunately, they're not helpful in terms of saying this is the level of what an incentive would be considered coercive, right? So it's just not clear. It's going to have to be done on a case-by-case basis and kind of use your common sense. Again, I think if you're doing an incentive program, again, this is before any government mandates, but if you're doing a vaccine incentive program, if they are going off-site and just doing it community-based and you're giving them whatever, PTO or even some cash, I think that's fine. The issue is going to be more of a problem as if it's going to be on-site. And I don't think there are a ton that are really doing, employers that are really doing the in-house vaccination programs, because it's really available everywhere now, outside in the community.
I was going to say, I think also if we look at where we are now, if we've been talking and doing this presentation 6 months ago, we'd be giving you very different advice on that. Because the EEOC was saying at that time, pretty much coercion is anything more than a coffee mug or some sort of, tchotchke type thing. Now we've got companies who are doing raffles for airline tickets, for prizes or things valued at over $1,000, $2,000. So very different from a coffee mug. So I used to advise, hey, let's keep it within a few $100. Now I think that's opened up, and you'd be safer to do a larger reward. In fact, a lot of employers, if you've done an incentive program, it's like, okay, we're stalled out at X percent. Let's try to get it another percent, vaccinated. Then I say, hey, do a larger reward for everybody who's vaccinated, and maybe do some additional rewards for those individuals who haven't gotten vaccinated, who get vaccinated between this period of time, and looking at that. That way you're kind of hitting it from both angles.
Yeah, I think Mike's right. I think, I wanted to bring up the coercion issue because, the EOC has made clear that that's something to look at. But as he said, I think it's not something that's really high on their radar right now. They're not, I think, super concerned about that. And obviously, I mean, we'll talk about everything that's coming down from the administration, but they're focused on getting people vaccinated. So I don't think they're focused too much on the coercion aspect right now.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
One way my clients have been dealing with that is that they've been offering it both. They've been because you've got employees that are going to be in two buckets. They don't want to do it in-house, or they do want to do it in-house because they'll know they'll get it done as opposed to doing it on their own. So if you offer it in both places where they can go external or internal, then you're not having to worry about that intense, having to get the medical documentation on site if an employee is uncomfortable with that. We have a question here. Yeah. You can just say it to me and I'm going to repeat it.
Okay, so I've seen that more companies are saying that they're not going to pay unvaccinated employees who are exposed. And so I was wondering if that's permissible to not pay exposed unvaccinated employees, and then if it is, how does that interplay with workers' comp?
Great. So the question is, if an unvaccinated employee gets exposed, can the employer not pay for that?
Yeah, so
Go ahead.
I'll go first. I've had that come up, with the client, definitely. At least right now, the current guidance is you can treat vaccinated versus unvaccinated employees differently, as long as that is the reason you're treating them differently, right? So I've had one to say, I want to give paid PTO if someone who's vaccinated gets sick, gets COVID, right, as a breakthrough case, but I don't want to pay for that paid leave if someone is not vaccinated. And as of right now, my understanding is that is okay to do. I don't know if you have anything else on that, Mike, but
No, I agree. I think that's something that you can absolutely do. But you want to be very careful in that distinction. Very much like when we talk incentive programs, if an employee who comes up with a disability or religious belief exemption, they still have to be eligible to participate in an incentive program. And they also would have to be able to, to participate in getting paid PTO if they're sick or get COVID. And part of that is, okay, what are our requirements that we're, have they complied with all these requirements? And so that,
Workers' comp if they're exposed.
for work comp, that would be different. And that kind of goes to, were they exposed or did they get it within the workplace? If it's somebody who's unvaccinated, with my experience on this, I can likely say if you go through a questionnaire on whether they limited themselves to going to and from work or whether they went to, say, a concert, a store, some other area where they could have contracted COVID, you're likely going to get a litany of answers that allow you to show that no, they could have got it somewhere outside of work, and we haven't had any other cases. We haven't had a breakout or epicenter within the workplace. It also goes to, even though we don't have the presumption for work comps under Illinois law still, but if we can show that we're complying with all the CDC guidance, recommendations even on this, it's going to make our argument against it being work comp even stronger.
okay, thanks, Mike. So a little bit on the penalties, right? So we talked about the rewards, and penalty is considered an incentive, but it's like I said, it's the stick here. So kind of the most public example of what happened recently was Delta Airlines, came out and said, we are going to implement a $200 monthly surcharge on our employees that have health insurance premiums if they're not vaccinated, and they set a date of November 1st, 2021. Now that generated a lot of press, and I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, but I do want to kind of parse out why Delta is a little bit different than maybe your average employer, right? So they base it on the rise of the Delta variant, no coincidence, I guess, and that the average hospital stay, at least Delta came out and said this, was costing them $50,000 per employee. I don't think that's a ridiculous number. That's probably based in some fact. And again, the final note here is that Delta employees, because of what they do, they're in the travel industry, on airlines, they are probably going to be considered higher risk of transmission and exposure just based on the industry they're in. So you can see why they had taken this position, and it was, I think, pretty aggressive for them to come out. And I had some questions from my clients before Delta had announced this, kind of on the same thing. Can we charge more, for our insurance premiums? And the short answer is yes, obviously, but we'll talk about it. There are definitely some things that you want to take into consideration. So surcharges, they raise major, and that's all caps, and they do raise major compliance issues. I don't want to get too specific into this, but we'll just kind of have a general overview. And I also hate to be the lawyer that stands up here and says, hire a lawyer. But if you are considering doing this type of insurance surcharge, consult with your counsel, because there are a lot of things, moving parts here that are going to come into play. So I'm just going to touch on some of these briefly. So you have, under federal law, employers can only charge higher health insurance premiums if it is within a wellness program. And an example of that is the smoking surcharge, right? You can charge your employees higher premiums based on the fact that they smoke. And really the purpose of that is to get them to stop smoking, right? So that stuff is allowed. And if you kind of look, it's similar to, I think, how this is being looked at in terms of the vaccination program, right? So you're putting the surcharge in there to kind of push people to get vaccinated, right? So trying to make them healthier, at least, based on, what the government is pushing for people to do right now. So the EOC limitations, it's the same thing as we talked about with rewards, right? It can't be coercive. But again, well, what is coercive? You just don't know. You don't want it to be too high, but you also want it to be high enough, right, to kind of push them to, because you're using this to get them vaccinated. I mean, that's the whole purpose of having this surcharge. So, and another thing to keep in mind is that rewards and penalties in a wellness program, they can't exceed 30% of the cost of employee-only coverage. And again, this is, I don't want to get too much in the weeds on this, but it's just something that if as the employer you are considering, doing a program like this, just be careful and make sure you're aware of all kind of the moving parts and the compliance considerations that are going on there. Just like anything else that we talked about again and again, if you any type of program you're putting in, mandate, soft mandate, incentives, penalties, whatever, be aware that you have to accommodate your employees. And especially it's going to be true if you're going to implement a penalty. Like, you need to make sure that you are clear that, and Mike touched on this already, that you need to make sure that these exemptions are available and clear to your employees before you're putting this in place. And just kind of a couple things to consider, if you're thinking about doing this type of insurance surcharge program. Lower wage workers are obviously going to be the ones, not obvious, shouldn't say obviously. Often lower wage workers you're going to find are the ones that aren't as vaccinated as higher wage workers. So a surcharge can have more of an impact on your lower wage workers. And it's going to affect morale. It could lead to a loss of some of your workforce. Just something to keep in mind, if you're going to do this insurance surcharge. I realize now after talking about it that maybe I was down on it, but it is definitely a program that you could consider, and it is at least currently legal if you follow all the compliance considerations.
All right, so now that we've talked about voluntary programs, we're going to get into a little bit of the government mandates. Things to remember when we talk about the government mandates: number one, it's not just federal government, although the federal government has implemented a lot. In fact, most recent news that we have is with the state of Illinois and the governor's executive order there. So what we're going to touch on is, I'm going to touch on the Illinois Executive Order 2021-20/22. You heard me talk about the two. He implemented one and then had to do an amendment to the second one. Then we're also going to talk about the federal government and the executive orders and path out of the pandemic, the COVID action plan that we have there. So these are changing regularly. In fact, since we did this presentation, more information came out, guidance came out from the federal task force on this past Friday. We haven't updated the slides, but we are going to talk about some of that, or John's going to talk about some of that. So,
or you could check the SmithAmundsen blog.
Oh, that's right. I forgot. This incredibly smart attorney for SmithAmundsen wrote an incredible article for it. Do you remember who that was?
I think that would be Heather Bailey.
That's right. All right. So going into the Illinois Executive Order, Governor Pritzker came down with the executive order. It had two parts. Number one, it had a mask mandate. So effective August 30th, all masks were required in any indoor indoor public space, it still had the same exemptions. So anybody who's under the age of 2 or cannot medically tolerate a face mask. All employers must ensure that employees wear face coverings in indoor workplaces. They can be removed within the workplace, so if they have a cubicle or if they have an office, once you're in that office, as long as you're not with another individual, you could remove your face mask. This is really pretty standard what we dealt with, going back a year ago when mask mandates first came out. In fact, when these came out, it's kind of like a time warp back. Get out those mask mandate signs that we'd torn up, stomped, and thrown in the trash, reprint them out, put down the floor markings again, put down, really just time warp us back about a year. It's like, Candyland, 2 steps forward, 5 steps back. All right, but then we added something new to this. It was a vaccine mandate for healthcare workers, K through 12 personnel, higher education, state-owned and operated facilities were all mandated or required to start doing vaccines. However, as we dug into it, it initially looked like a hard vaccine policy because it said you have to get your first dose by X date, you have to get your second dose by the Y date, and during that time period, if you aren't vaccinated, you have to get tested on a weekly basis. It didn't say that people could continue to be tested afterwards. Thank you, Illinois Department of Public Health, for quietly just putting out some guidance, some questions, FAQs on this, that quietly, again, no sudden announcement, no major, hey, guess what, guys, you should look here, but quietly said, oh, by the way, if somebody doesn't want to get vaccinated, they can just continue to get tested on a weekly basis. So that's where we got into the soft mandate. Illinois Department of Public Health provided that kind of guidance there. When we get into the testing, the employee was just required to provide test results on a weekly basis. It didn't say it had to be produced on Monday, it didn't say it had to be produced by Friday, just for that week. For them to be able to come into the office or come into the facility and work, they had to provide it. So if they didn't provide it one week, did that prevent you from allowing them into the office the next week? Absolutely. Until they produced a test result, they could not come into the facility. Could they, work remotely if that was optional? Absolutely. But if that wasn't an option, could you put them on unpaid leave? Yes. Could it be a disciplinary issue? Yes. Essentially, there was no real guidance from the state on how to address those issues, other than they couldn't come into the facility. So those were kind of what we had to go through. We'll get into a little bit more of the who had to pay for what. But let's go to our next one, which is the president, his executive order. So September 9th, we got a whole new action by President Biden. He took action, as I like to say, sort of. It's kind of like the whole story for the past 18 months. We're going to take action, sort of. He issued a 6-prong COVID action plan called Path Out of the Pandemic. He talked about vaccinating the unvaccinated, protecting the unvaccinated, keeping schools safely open, increasing testing and requiring masking, protecting economic recovery. And really what it came down to is 6 prongs that implicated workers. Was it implicated federal employees by changing a soft mandate for federal employees to a hard mandate, meaning they had to get vaccinated. Then for those who weren't federal employees, it took a step further for federal contractors. So if you have any federal contracts, we'll go into the details there, but it set specific requirements, essentially, that if you're a federal contractor or provide information on or part of that to getting federal funding, that you had to comply and put into place a soft mandate. Then it announced employers with 100 or more employees, you're going to have to implement a testing or a vaccine policy. Got a question?
Yeah. So 100 of employees, does that count for just general body count, or does it also count for FTE?
Yes. So the question is, how do I count 100 employees? Is it just full-time employees? Does it take into consideration seasonal? Does it take into consideration part-time? All of those things.
I mean, we do have a slide on this, but unfortunately it's not that clear. Until the ETS comes out, I think they will. I mean, we're kind of guessing that it might be the FLSA, common control test. We're not sure yet, but I can tell you, and I'm sort of jumping ahead, but the DL came out with some initial guidance when the president said we're going to do this OSHA ETS, right? And said that for sure, I can tell you that it's going to be per enterprise and not just per location. So I can tell you that right now, but that's really all we know at this point.
Yes.
And all businesses have a private and public sector, or just private?
That again, this is the wonderful world that we're up here kind of guessing on some of this, because we don't have the actual ETS out, and they're piecemealing the information out. What I can say is it's likely, going to cover both, and I would say if you're a public entity, you are likely going to be set to a higher standard than private employers, especially if you're a public employer and you are getting federal funding. So that's the state government, governor in Illinois especially has already said stuff about public employers, especially schools. I would expect that's going to be pushed further and further upon. But I think for this, the 100 employees will likely be targeting more private employers, but just for the pure fact that public employers are already going to be covered by something else. So if you haven't found that you're covered yet, I would start planning for it, just like every other employer with 100 or more, because it's something that will likely be coming down the line. Oh yeah. So we talked about healthcare workers and school employees. So both of those, we've seen the Illinois executive order on it. That's something that we already have an ETS from OSHA out covering healthcare and workers. That's going to be expanded even more than where it currently is. And then school employees, currently OSHA and the CDC are saying they're recommended. I fully expect that will become more of a requirement soon.
Okay, so let's talk about the federal contractor vaccine mandate. So this is one of President Biden's executive orders that came out on September 9th. And there is confusion on this, so I want to be very clear. This is not, for the next couple slides, I will not be talking about the OSHA emergency temporary standard that's coming out. This is instead a very different thing that the president did within his authority, because mostly it's affecting federal employees, right? So we're not going to deal with that because I don't think there are really many federal employers in here. But I want to talk about this federal contractor vaccine mandate. When it came out on September 9th, the order was somewhat clear on who it applied to, but not that clear. But we can go through some of the things so you can help you determine whether or not, like, hey, am I a federal contractor? I just don't know. So it's going to be either a contract or contract-like instrument. I mean, we'll just assume a contract. This next bullet point is important. So it's whether these contracts were entered into, extended, renewed, or has an option exercised on or after October 15, 2021. So if you're operating if you think, hey, I'm a federal contractor and you're operating under a current contract that one of these things aren't being triggered, this executive order is likely not going to apply to you. I will tell you that the government has encouraged all agencies to put these clauses in their contract, and that's another important point that brought up in my mind that I want you guys to be aware of, that this executive order isn't really telling employers what to do. It's telling the federal agencies what to do. It's saying you need to put in your contracts that are new, extended, renewed, or whatever, this clause that says your contractors who are under this contract are going to have their employees vaccinated. So I want to be clear that the onus is more on a federal agency, but it is going to affect a private employer that is entering into these contracts with the federal government. So what it said, who was covered, again, it listed these things, but it wasn't super clear. So, services, what exactly is a service? It's hard to know. Construction, that's usually a little bit clearer. Leasehold interest in property, and then these other things that are covered. Concessions, again, you think that's clear, but again, not totally clear. And then the last one is work relating to federal property or lands. And I don't want to spend too much time on what it's covering. I want to go more to the next slide, where things that the executive order explicitly excluded for federal contractors. So the first three, federal grants, contracts with Indian tribes, employees who work outside the United States, are all pretty clear. The last two I want to focus on a little bit. Just be aware that it's only going to cover contracts that are equal or greater than the simplified acquisition threshold, which right now is $250,000. It's explained in the Federal Register. That's where they list how much it is. So it's currently $250,000. So if you are operating on a federal contract that's less than $250,000, this executive order isn't going to apply to you probably. And the same thing for subcontracts solely for the provision of products. So that this is usually going to affect more manufacturers. So if you're a manufacturer providing some type of product to another entity that is the one that is contracting with the federal government, it's not going to apply to you as well. So there were a lot of questions, unanswered questions that, he issued this executive order as one, maybe 2 pages long. And there are a lot of questions that came up. And it had said in the order that the Safer Federal Workforce Task Force, which is a mouthful to say, but the task force was going to issue their guidance by September 24th, 2021, which was last Friday. And we already talked about it. And lo and behold, they actually did issue some guidance on this. And I will say, for the most part, it didn't really answer the who is a federal contractor question. But what it did answer is if you are a covered contractor, how does this apply to you? So it was a little clear in that manner. So one of the big questions before was, is it only going to apply to on-site contractors? So only to employees who are working under a contract that actually go onto federal property, right? And that's what the soft mandate was before. That was issued in July. That applied only to employees working under the contract that went onto actual federal property. The guidance is now clear that that's thrown out the window. It really expanded it. It's much broader now. So if you are an employer working under a federal contract, your employees who are in that workplace, so one work site that you have as an employer, if you have any employees working on the contract there, they must be vaccinated, and all the other employees there have to be vaccinated as well. So they really kind of broadened the scope of this mandate. So the guidance was clear that covers. They had a couple small carve-outs. If you have a remote worker who is 100% remote and not working on the contract, then they're not covered. But if anyone who's working on the contract comes into contact with them, say they come onto the work site like 1 day a week or whatever, then they're covered. And this is all very new, just came out Friday, so we kind of scrambled to kind of interpret this guidance as best we can. But I think that is a fair reading of it, that it really is a much broader reach now. Another thing was a question that they had was whether or not there would be the exceptions, so the religious or the disability exception to get, to not have this vaccine mandate. And the guidance was clear, yes. And this covers everything. Any type of policy, and now even this government mandate, you need to have those exceptions built in for disability or a sincerely held religious belief. And no more soft mandate. And that's true. So this federal contractor executive order essentially said, no more testing option. If you fall under all this, if you're a federal contractor and you have employees working in your workplace under this contract, they must be vaccinated, period. However, because they allow exceptions, testing is probably going to be okay as long as it's just the exceptions. But be aware that if you do fall under this, it's most likely going to be a hard vaccine mandate. Okay, we need to drink water before we get into this. This is obviously the big question I think that a lot of employers have, right? So there's some OSHA emergency rule. And I've already talked about it somewhat, but at the same time that he issued these executive orders, he said OSHA will be coming out with this ETS that says all employers with 100 or more employees have to be vaccinated or produce a weekly negative test. So now that we've been through this presentation, you know that that is a soft mandate. So it's not a hard mandate like I was just talking about, but it is a soft mandate. So you have to do one or the other as an employer. And employers, I think, are going to be able to choose if they want to implement a straight hard mandate under that, because that technically would be allowable under the rule, or if they want to do the soft mandate. And some of these bullet points here, just to keep in mind, OSHA, I expect them to really police this, right? I mean, clearly the administration wants people to be vaccinated. They're using the, OSHA to kind of get this out there, and they're going to enforce it. So as an employer, you need to be ready for this coming down. So, it's within their power, as it says there, if the standard, if it can enforce it, if there's a grave danger. We're in a global pandemic. I think COVID-19 is considered a grave danger to other workers, right? So that's going to be covered. You're looking at probably a $14,000 fine per violation if you're an employer that falls under this and you're not following it. Again, it's not going to be super clear yet until the rule comes out, but that's what we're expecting. Up to now, OSHA has been kind of pursuing the masks and other COVID-19 safety procedures and has been issuing fines. So they're not being shy about it. So I expect it to continue as this goes forward. And again, I think a big question is, how is it going to be per violation, per facility, per time, an unvaccinated person comes into the office? I just don't know yet, right? So I assume it's probably going to be $14,000 for each facility inspected by OSHA, where a covered employer is determined to have not been following the rule, right? So that's what we expect to happen. Still, it's not an insignificant amount of money. So just be prepared when this comes down. And Mike already talked about this, but if you are, more of a white collar employer, more of an office environment, you probably haven't dealt with OSHA or the OSH Act a whole lot. That's going to change. You're going to have to deal with them because OSHA is going to enforce this for everyone, and it is going to have a big impact on banks, law firms, and other professional, white collar type work environments. When is it going to be issued? That's what everyone wants to know, right? When is this coming down? I will say that when Biden announced it on September 9th, he said he wanted OSHA to issue its rule between 2 to 8 weeks. We are now approaching 3 weeks, and it's not out yet. I can tell you the previous ETS that Biden had ordered OSHA to issue, and it did, he said he wanted them to do it in 2 months. It took them 5 months. So they don't move fast, but I think they are going to move as fast as they can here to get it out. But as we're standing here, I can't tell you when it's going to come out, but it will come out. I do want to clear about that. So, what about enforcement, right? I think there's going to be a grace period because as Mike already talked about too, with mandates, if you're having a policy, you need to build in the first dose, second dose, the 2 weeks after for the to be fully vaccinated. So they're going to give you some leeway and some time probably to get that into place. And then the last bullet point here just talks about states that don't have OSHA state plans. Essentially, that's just to be aware of. If you're in Illinois, that's really not an issue. If you're a private employer, just know that the ETS is going to apply to you. And even if you're in a state where you have your own OSHA, then they have to implement a very similar plan within 15 or 30 days. So regardless, this is going to come down. Unanswered questions from the ETS. Currently, there's a lot. There's a lot of unanswered questions. And I think, when Mike said, all your questions will be answered by the end of the presentation, and not really. He was joking, because it's just not clear at this point. We were going back and forth and wondering, will they have maybe it come out by the time our presentation, comes up, but they don't. So, but we can cover some of these questions and kind of anticipate what we think is going to happen here, right? Our remote employee is going to be covered. I think similar to the federal contractor mandate, I would say probably not. If they're 100% remote and work all remote, then they're probably not going to be covered. I wouldn't think that would make sense. We already talked about the 100 employee threshold, right? So we don't have a clear answer right now as to how that's going to be, other than it's going to be on a company-wide basis and not per location. And we've talked about paid leave, right, for getting vaccinated, and is it compensable time? In looking at the healthcare ETS, which came out sometime in the summer, where they mandated vaccines for healthcare employees, they did build in a paid time off to get vaccinated and for symptoms, so for side effects from getting the dose. So in healthcare employers were forced to give some type of leave. It did build in, it allowed them to do the PTO if they wanted, but there is definitely, you have to provide some type of paid leave for your employees to get vaccinated or for side effects from the vaccine. Expect, and again, the type of testing, so this is a soft mandate, right? I don't know, there's just a lot of questions. I don't know what type of testing it's going to be. how often. I think it's probably going to be weekly at least. So expect that. And this will be subject to legal challenges. There's no doubt that this is, governors have already said, of red states, that they're going to sue on this. So, is it going to be stayed while that is? I don't know. I mean, I think the next slide will kind of cover this, but I think you need to be ready for it to come down, right? So, you need to decide, and I talked about this already, so this ETS is coming down. Do I want to do a hard mandate or a soft mandate? The floor from the ETS is going to be a soft mandate. So are you going to allow them to be tested, or do you want to say, hey, we want you to be vaccinated? So that's kind of the first step. And then this is very important, and we talked about this a little bit, but you want to draft and set up a policy, a written policy that is very clear as to what you expect your employees to do and what you're going to be doing as the employer. So if you want to have reporting procedures, right? So are you going to ask for documentation? And if you do, you want to make sure that documentation is kept separate from their personnel file because it's confidential information. And you want to keep it on a need-to-know basis, and as few people as possible know this. Sure.
All right, so the question was, if you use an electronic filing system, what's the best way to keep that separate? Oh, I caught John taking a drink. All right, so if you're gonna, it'd be very similar to if you have personnel files that are electronic. You also likely have medical files that are kept electronic for those employees. You're gonna wanna have those separated. You're gonna wanna have their password protected, limited access to those folders where those files are kept. You want to have those safety procedures just like you would if they were paper files. So if you had them in paper files, you'd likely have them in their own separate filing cabinet that's probably under lock and key, or in somebody's office that is under lock and key. And so very much the same when we start talking about digital, we want to have those separated and security protocols in place to make sure that they're kept confidential. And we limit who has access to them as well. And in terms of access, you want to make sure it's only those with the business need to know. So that doesn't mean just because you're a senior management individual that you have a need to know that. It's whether you're involved in it. It could mean that we do have to disclose some of that information to managers so that we can explain that an employee has to take time off to get tested, or that we're going to allow them to take time to get tested, or that they're going to go get tested within the building at a certain time. So there's going to be a little more broadness to that, but that doesn't mean we have to give them access to the files. That help? You would be surprised with just a regular Windows basis that you can put password protection on files or even a larger folder, and so implementing that at the very basic would be a good idea.
Thanks, Mike. I agree with all that, and it goes to just about any of these policies that we're talking about, whether government or not. If you have any type of policy or even incentive program where you are looking at or asking, hey, are you vaccinated? You need to make sure that this stuff is kept separate, and that I don't think we've talked about this, but that you don't ask follow-up questions, outside of the exemption issue, but you're asking just yes or no, and then you keep that documentation separate. That's really the most important at this time. So again, I was just talking about the policies and what you want to have in there, and again, this is just getting ready for the ETS that's coming, and this could also apply to if you're going to have any type of other policy, the mandate, soft mandate, incentive programs. You want to have a written policy that's very clear of what the expectations for your employees are. So if you're going to allow weekly testing under the soft mandate of the ETS, how are you going to, again, provide it in testing in-house, or are you going to have them be able to do it on their own? How are you going to track it? Who's going to track it? And again, this comes down to, you want to keep it confidential and keep it as few people as possible kind of in the loop on that. And then we've talked about this already too, determine the repercussions for failing to be tested or provide test results. So you want to be clear in your policy that, if we are following this testing, the soft mandate by the government, and you do not provide us with the test, you can't come into the office. You can't do this, and if it continues, then you will be disciplined up to including termination. That is something you want to make very clear in your policies. You want to have a plan for tracking test results. You want to develop a plan for handling accommodation requests. And again, I sound like a broken record, but we will talk about that, I promise. And again, something I touched on already is prepare for OSHA complaints and inspections. And if you're more of a professional environment and haven't dealt with this, just kind of be ready for it. I expect them to be very aggressive in enforcing this rule to the extent it's upheld by the courts, but you just want to be ready. And I know there's a lot of questions out there, and we're not sure how it's going to look in the actual form of the rule, but these are things that you can start thinking about now to get ready for when this actually does come down.
Yeah, and on the OSHA complaints and inspections, those are something that are nuanced. You literally could have OSHA show up to your facility and say, hey, we're here for an inspection. And, we've had clients call us and say, hey, they're waiting here. Can you get here? And it absolutely sounds just like I said. It is an absolute fire drill. I've got a suit in my office that I kept hanging up just in case I was in the office and not in a suit and got one of those calls, because it has happened to me. And literally, do you have to let OSHA in the door? You can let them in the door, but you can require them to wait in your sitting room until your legal counsel or somebody else that you want to be there to handle it gets there who's familiar with the process. Now, the other part to this is always ask for identification, because how do you know they're from OSHA other than them telling you? You want to make sure you're taking the proper steps to ensure that they really are who they say they are. But once you get that call, should you be contacting your lawyer? Absolutely. In fact, it's good protocol right now to give them a call and say, hey, if this happens, do you have a checklist or do you have something that I can look at to know what procedures I need to have in play or what I need to be doing to get ready in case this happens? I like to say ounce of prevention is worth a pound of flesh, and it's the same thing with this.
Can I jump in real quickly? Sorry. I just want to make sure something was clear for all of our federal contractors out there. The task force came down and said a remote employee is not exempt from the vaccination mandate, only the masking and social distancing mandate. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear for the federal contractors out there. Now, what those are going to do, we obviously have to wait and see, but my guess is they're all worried about the workplace, so hopefully remote workers won't be. But just for the federal contractors out there, they did say that the federal contract employee, even if working remotely, still is required to get the vaccine. I just want to make sure that was clear.
Right. Thanks, Heather.
I got a question up there.
I've got another question for the federal contractors. You said in the questionnaire that they should be, you get the vaccine, yes, no, without much elaboration. But for federal contractors, oftentimes we have to also kind of, if the answer is no, I know you said don't ask why, but do we have the multiple choice then for, is your reason for religious, is your reason for ADA? Just so that we can show, without that we don't get funding, right?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. The question was essentially, I'm going to distill it, was, because we had said that you want to be really careful about when you're asking your employees whether or not they're vaccinated or not. Like I usually do counsel a yes or no only, right? But when you're coming now, you have this federal contractor mandate, and so the question was, can we go a little bit beyond that, right? Can we ask, is it because if you check no for, you're not vaccinated, why, right? I think that's a tricky area, but I would say yes. I think as long as it's relatively targeted and limited, are you essentially maybe set it up? Are you requesting an exemption, right?
Well, yeah, and that's where if you have an ADA exemption form or a religious accommodation or religious exemption form, you can have a follow-up question: is have you submitted a request for an exemption under a disability or a religious? If they check no there, then you're like, okay, we're not going down that form, and you're just asking whether they've applied for it. If they have, then you can pull up that exemption form that they've submitted.
Okay, I think this is you.
Yeah,
right,
so
Mike?
going on to the vaccine mandate issues, talking now broadly, we're talking about for all mandates, government and employer, do we have to provide time off? You heard John talk about that a little bit. Likely, yes. Paid or PTO, probably. I expect that we'll likely see some legislation come down, similar to the FFCRA, that provided paid sick leave or paid time off for employees doing the similar and providing employers a tax credit for when they provided that. I expect that to be some sort of legislation to come down once OSHA comes out with their ETS. It also depends on your locality. You heard me mention Cook County and City of Chicago. Under both of those, they prohibit employers from requiring employees to go get vaccinated outside work. So we have to allow an employee, if they're going to get vaccinated, to go during working hours. Is getting vaccinated compensable time? I think it depends on the circumstances. It depends on whether it's required. If we are requiring it, you heard me say yes. If we're not requiring it as part of a soft mandate, then maybe no. It depends on how hard of a standard that we set there. But if we do allow them to go during working hours and we do have a policy in place, I'd likely say yes, that's going to be compensable time then. Can we set a time limitation on how long they have to go get vaccinated? Yeah, I see no problem with that. However, while you may tell them it's a hard deadline, like let's say 4 hours, if they come back and said it took me 4.5 because of this reason or X, Y, Z, should you maybe go ahead and pay that half an hour just to avoid the potential litigation or exposure? In my mind, I'd say probably. It'd be a good practice too. Fake documentation, we talked about that. Make sure to address in your policy. What about refusals? Address that in your policy. Making sure those are clear that if they do this, this is what's going to happen. So then we go on to mandatory testing issues. Testing is different than vaccine. So if we have a soft mandate and we don't require them to get vaccinated and their option is to get tested, like you heard me say, the vaccine is not a required medical test, but then our test, that is required. So that is something that we're gonna have to pay for. So if they need to take time off to get tested, we're likely gonna be stuck paying for it. That's where it comes into play. Are we gonna do it on-site or are we gonna do it off-site? In my mind, the administration of an on-site program, even though it's an increased cost, is going to make your life seem like floating in a Sealy Posturepedic bed. Why is that? Because you control when the employee goes. You could have them set up in phases throughout the week of when they're going to go get tested. You control where they go to get tested. It's on site. So they could go. You're going to have to pay for the test. But guess what? You know the test results right away. You're not having to chase employees down to get those test results. And so your administration of the whole testing process will likely be easier. However, it is something you have to look at that cost because it is something that we're going to have to look at. So I got a few questions here. Right up front first, and I'll get you. Home test. Right now, under the Illinois Executive Order, those rapid tests, those are allowed. In fact, I've used some from Walgreens. They work fantastic, give you a test result in 15 minutes. I love the University of Illinois. I'm from Champaign. I went to college there. Their STEAM testing is fantastic. All schools are lucky because they have access to it. If we could ever get that available for private employers, it'd be fantastic. In fact, both my sons are in elementary school. They get tested on a weekly basis through that. Those are all. I think the standard Illinois has said is as long as it's approved or viewed by the CDC or FDA as being approved, you can allow that. There is specific language on that, so you want to be careful. But it is something that we can do that. All right. Sure. So that's a great question. If you didn't hear, what about if you're a 24-hour employer, you've got employees who are working overnight, and they don't follow the traditional clock in, clock out time? Is that something where you'd have to pay for them to get it tested while off hours? I think that's something in my mind that would probably drive doing an on-site testing a little even further, because then you're not even worrying about them going out. You're not worrying about that. You just have somebody go to the location and test all those on a 24-hour basis, or you provide the test for them to test and have them send a picture of it that's then stored in the confidential medical file for that week. So that is a consideration. My view, though, is if they're in a 24-hour basis and they're working hand in hand with clients or patients or whoever, that might push me a little more towards having them doing a required vaccination, because then we're not worrying about it. Okay. Test results must be written. Type of test, entity administering the test, collection date, identification of person, test result. That's what's required by the state of Illinois in their executive order. Can they continue to work while we're waiting results? Yes, they can continue to work all the way through the week as long. There's no definition on whether a set time can be set. Can we set a set day that they have to provide it? Absolutely. I think that's, again, pushes me towards an on-site testing because of the ease of administration. On this, you would, again, be stuck if you checking at the end of the week who didn't provide their test results, chasing them down. If they haven't provided it, making sure they are provided and advising them that they can't come into work and that'll be an unpaid time off until they provide test results. Can we have a policy of discipline for not providing timely results, including termination? Absolutely. In fact, I would try to stress that if you're going to do off-site and set up maybe even discipline written warnings, final written warnings on addressing it, similar to attendance issues. Yes, and Beth.
When you're talking about having the mandatory testing, having the testing on site, are you talking about like an existing HR employee administering these tests, or hiring like a nurse practitioner or some kind of contractor?
Great question. So the question is, if we're doing on-site testing, are we doing it ourselves, having somebody from HR doing it, or are we hiring somebody like a third-party vendor to do it? Personally, my view would be use a third-party vendor. That way you're not having to be, they're the ones getting the tests for you, making your life a little bit easier. Now, if you're in the medical field, that might be a little bit different too. Because if you're a regular business and you don't have anybody in the medical field working for you, then it's kind of like going back to the beginning when we were doing the screening. We have to designate an employee to do it, and that employee, we have to talk about the proper medical procedure in order for them to do those testing. And it just opens up a whole can of worms. I see Heather kind of nodding at me like she's going to jump down and wanted to explain everything. But absolutely, it's one of those that makes it a lot more complicated if you're not in the medical field, because you're having to identify an employee to do these things for you that isn't trained in how to do that. So there's going to be certain methods that you're going to have to go through. So using a third-party vendor is likely going to make your life a lot easier. All right, jump to the next slide here. Wage and hour mandatory testing, on-site, off-site. You heard me kind of propose or say the on-site is preferred. Why? Again, you're limiting the time period off that they're doing to get it. You're doing it during their paid time, during their schedule, so you're not worrying about the wage and hour issues. If you do it off-site, there are the questions of, do I have to pay them for that time? Right now, it's starting to trend towards, yeah, you would, if it's a required medical procedure, like a drug test that you're doing. And then that comes on with its own issues of you're telling the employee that they need to track their time and report that time to you. Those are the considerations of doing an offsite one, so you have to be careful with it. Cook County, like I said, they don't allow you to require employees to do outside of normal working hours. So if they wanted to go get it, that's for vaccinations. Do we see that going to testing? I would say yeah. I think it's not written yet, but I could see it going that way. We jump on to the next slide. I want to kind of jump through here because I think we're running out of time.
We are.
Yeah.
So I'm going to briefly talk about these exemptions, at least kind of generally, and then the medical, and then Mike will run through as quick as he can the religious ones. But as we talked about throughout the presentation today, right, you must consider exemptions under the ADA or Title VII. So ADA is going to be your typical medical disability, reasonable accommodation requests. Religious is going to be a sincerely held religious belief, and we have on here as well the Illinois Healthcare Right of Conscience Act. I wanted to bring that up just because I've already had some clients come to me and say, hey, I have some employees that are throwing this, statute, it's out there, whether it's on Facebook or whatever, the employees are latching onto this. And I want to be clear that it says Right of Conscience Act, but if you read the actual definitions in the statute, it is essentially sincerely held religious belief. I mean, there's some language there that allows you to kind of have a parallel non-religious belief, but it essentially is a religious belief. It's not, I don't like, I'm just objecting to vaccines, right? That is not sufficient, even though it says Right of Conscience Act. So I wanted to be clear on that. And then I'm going to talk briefly, because I think most employers are going to know how to handle exemptions requested under the ADA, right? So disability. It's going to be no different than any other reasonable accommodation request. If an employee is coming to you saying, I need whatever, I need this accommodation because of this disability. The process is going to be very similar to that. So I assume most of you are kind of, familiar with how that works. But in this instance, you just need to be aware that the disability is important because it needs to be a medical contraindication that is a valid reason for that employee not to be able to get the vaccine. So they have something, whatever it is, and you're going to follow the ADA interactive process as you would for anything else. You can request documentation from the doctor. Don't be shy about that. If it's not sufficient, ask for more. I've had clients, come back with the doctor's note that just has like 2 sentences. Like, that's not enough. It is okay to go back and say, hey, I need more information on this because I don't know if you really are disabled or what the reason is why you cannot get the vaccine. So you just kind of fall back on your processes. And as Mike said, forms are a great idea because they do kind of limit to what the employee can put on there, and you're getting the information that you actually want. So I don't want to spend too much time on that because Mike wants to talk about religion.
In fact, John, I'm going to steal the clicker for you so I can go through this a little faster. All right, everybody, you ready for the religious aspect of this? As I said, warning. This is very different from our ADA interactive process. ADA interactive process is very easy. Why? Because I'm not a doctor. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn last night, and it's very easy to just point to the doctor, say, I need this information. I need, what condition they have, why they can't get the vaccine, the duration of period that they can't get the vaccine. Under the religious exemption, we don't have that. Why? We cannot require an employee to provide a statement from a religious leader. That's just not something that we have to do. The next part of that is, what's a sincerely held religious belief? Extremely vague. Extremely vague. It's viewed as beliefs concerning ultimate ideas, views about life, purpose of death, and our ultimate being. Theistic beliefs as to non-theistic, moral or ethical beliefs as to what is right and wrong, which are sincerely held within the strength of a traditional religious view. A whole lot of, what I like to say, sometimes garbage, because it makes our lives difficult to weed out the wheat from the chaff and try to determine who really has a religious belief. The other part to this is it's not limited to traditional religious beliefs. We all view, if they turn in a request form and it has, religious scripture cited or religious practice cited, that's easy because we can look at that. However, it's not that. It's specific to individuals. So even if an individual is Catholic, which they can point to the religious practice or statements from the Catholic Church, they can have divergent views. For example, in this case, the Catholic Church has said getting the vaccine is now okay. But for a period of time, they didn't come out with a statement. And so you can still have a Catholic religious belief that you don't believe in the vaccine, that you should be exempt because of your views on abortion, versus what the actual Catholic Church is now saying. So the other part to this is when we get into the EOC and the court systems, they say, it's almost already a presumption that whatever employee requests this, it should be accommodated because it should be considered a sincerely held religious belief. So we're fighting an uphill battle, especially at this point where we're questioning, is this really sincere? Yep. So when we get into that, what factors are we considering? Number one, it's credibility. And there's a number of different questions that we can ask when it comes to credibility. But as I like to say, the EEOC definitely hired an attorney to write their credibility statement, because it's always, well, except if this happens, or except if that happens, because there's definitely credibility questions. Is this something that they've followed for a long period of time? For example, we have put together forms that we've used, and then we ask, have you gotten other vaccines before? Have you gotten the flu vaccine, influenza vaccine? Have you gotten, Tdap? You know, have you gotten these before? And it's a question of, okay, if they're saying they have, then what's their objection to getting this one? Of course, then you go to the exception, which says that a person can change their views overnight. Which, again, like I said, it makes it difficult. When we talk about this, you know, there's one here from the EEOC, or Hussein versus Waldorf Story. He professed a religious need to wear a beard. However, for the past 14 years, he'd never mentioned any religious beliefs, simply showed up one night and asking for an exemption. So then we have to look at, is this truly because of a religious belief, or is this because of a personal belief? And that's one that I think is easier, especially if you have employees saying, oh, well, so-and-so was saying they're never going to get the vaccine because of X belief, or because they don't believe in big government, or because of X, Y, and Z, that's unrelated to religious aspects in sort of way. So are there certain formal or external signs, too, of a sincerely held religious belief? Absolutely. Go to the EEOC page, take a look at it. It talks about, you know, are there teachers or leaders, so religious leaders? Are there services or ceremonies, structured organization? Is there, you know, orders or scriptures that they follow? Are there certain religious objects or religious beliefs, items that they use to show their belief? So those are all things that are considered there. Yes? And that's, I think you summarized
Can you repeat
the
the
exact
question,
problem,
please?
and that's what I was going to just repeat. It was, the question was, you know, for example, public employers where they've told you to keep your religious beliefs outside of the workplace or professional workplace. You've told employees, hey, listen, don't bring your religion into the workplace. And now you're stuck with kind of dealing with their requests and trying to analyze it and determine whether or not it's sincerely held, because you've never heard of this person holding this belief before or not. Part of that, I would say, goes to the form that you're using. The other part to that goes to, yes, you know, if they can tie it to some sort of religion, unlike an ADA where we can ask for a doctor's note, we're kind of stuck believing them and taking them at their word. Now, that doesn't mean we automatically have to grant it. And the reason I get into that is because a lot of times we will get these statements, and trust me, we've been going through a ton of them recently too. And when you're reading them, you start questioning, okay, is this because of a religious belief? Or is this because of a personal view? And you highlighted one that I like especially, is where they start talking about the effects of the vaccine. And they start talking about the health benefits of the vaccine. And when they start talking about that, well, I don't believe, or it's dangerous because of X, Y, and Z, or I've done my research on the vaccine and I don't want to take it because of those reasons, that, in my view, is a personal view. that's not a religious view, but so religious is I'm not getting it because of my religious has views against abortion, as mentioned, or I'm not getting it because. Well, yeah, and I understand that, and I think there's certain parts within that, and there's case law that some state, even the one view of, okay, I'm going to, or one that we went over is holistic. So an employee says, I have a holistic view on medicine. Holistic view does not automatically equate to religion, okay? But some religions, they do have a very specific view on what type of medical procedures or what type of medicine they are willing to accept or not. And if it's tied to that, yes, then it's medical exception. And that's the difficult part with these requests, is because it's something that cuts both ways. For one person, it absolutely can be a medical or a religious exemption, but for another person who words it slightly differently, it's not going to be an exemption. And so that it's, can they tie it to a strongly held religious belief, or is there any indication that this is more a personal view on vaccines, whether that even be political, whether that be personal, whether that be, especially anytime starts talking about doing studies on the medical benefits or medical issues within it, to me that's a red flag that it's not a religious belief.
Mike, sorry, Wong, I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
Just about, Mike. So but we can take a question or two, I bet.
Yeah.
What would you advise a client that says, okay, I'll go through this process, but from a pragmatic point of view, if the alternative is to be tested weekly, so go test. I mean, this is an area where I'm thinking, life is short and resources are scarce. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on this if they're challenging someone's personal, this exemption. Okay, you bring it up, I'm going to approve it, go get tested. I'm going to have a policy on testing. So would you say that that's not a good thing to think of?
Yeah, so, and the question is, okay, why do I even bother, objecting to a religious exemption if their other option is a soft mandate, they can still get tested? Well, the danger I warn there is if you give them a religious exemption for this, guess what? They got a religious exemption. And you're recognizing that they have a sincerely held religious belief that could impact other areas of the job as well. And so that's the one warning I have on it. That's why I also say if they're going to have the religious exemption or an ADA exemption, have certain things set in place as to, okay, we're going to exempt you from it, but you have to do these additional things, such as additional training. You're going to be required to wear a face mask. It may even require you to wear a face shield. Or undergo specific training on washing your hands and proper hygiene and compliance with CDC guidelines. And you want to make it number one, if they do get sick, you want to be able to point to those and say, hey, listen, this didn't happen in our workplace because we require these additional procedures. We're making sure they're safe. But number two, you want them to understand it's not just simply a way to get around it. The other part we were talking about on the exemption from the vaccine. Now, what if they say, well, what about the testing? Anybody got an exemption request from testing yet? Yes. And so that's going to be the next hurdle that we have to deal with. In my mind, testing is very different from the vaccine. It's something that it's not necessarily going to be something that has to be accommodated. It could be that we have to provide or direct them to get tested in a different way, but it's not something that we're going to be faced with providing a complete exemption from it. All right.
Can you foresee that down the road, we talk about the exemptions, but I'm thinking about disparate impact. Is that anything that's being talked about?
It isn't being talked about at this point, and the likely reason for that is because of the certain circumstances that we're currently in, the pandemic. And anytime before the pandemic came around, anytime we were implementing any sort of policies, if we could point to safety, that was like our view of like, oh, we're in a safe zone now. Because this is based on safety, and that's the exact same view I'd take now, is that these are relating to safety issues that we can point to. And that's, a lot of times why we actually can do this now. So again, once we do get out of the pandemic, once that is changed, we're going to have to roll a lot of these policies back really quickly. But it is at this point where, because of the safety issue, we can't point to it. Yes.
So if an employee was allowed to work remote during COVID refuses to come back to the office because they won't get vaccinated for religious reasons, what can the employer mandate?
That's an interesting one because we've already shown that we can accommodate them by working remotely. And so likely we're going to be stuck in the position of providing that as an accommodation to allow them to work remotely. But it also then you're going to, in my mind, it looks to a variety of different, what their job entails. Does their job entail working with a team? And does a lot of that work occur in the office? And I think John's going to jump on.
I've actually had that come up with an employee, of a client who said, "You let me work remote. Why can't I continue? You're calling all people back into the office, right? But I don't want to." It might be changed circumstances. In this instance, it was they had other people leave. They had a policy they were going to implement. This might be changed now with Delta, but they were saying you have to come into the office, and this is now our policy. And so it's an uphill battle for sure by having to deal with this, but there are things you can rely on. You can say, as Mike said, the job duties require you to come in now. We are requiring everyone else to come in. We're shorthanded, whatever. There are certain reasons that you can do, I think, to kind of try to get that person back. But as we said, it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was going to point here, is even after we go through an exemption, the next question is, does it create an undue burden for us? Or is there safety issues that come up as a result of it? And would that require us to, for example, an employee who works in an ER, if they say, hey, I have a religious exemption from the vaccine, you're saying, but you're working with these people on a daily basis. There's too much danger and risk for us to allow you, not just for yourself, but to the patients and other employees, to allow you to be unvaccinated. So we're going to move you to a different position or change your job in some way, or we're not going to agree to provide you the exemption.
We're being told we have to stop.
Well, one more question.
Real quick, unemployment benefits payable to people in the public sector if an employee is terminated because he refuses to comply with the first scenario. Second scenario is when an employee is put on unpaid leave of absence, can they argue that it's a constructive discharge and therefore payable?
Yep. So the first question is if a public employee, if they have an exemption and they're terminated or they quit, can they get unemployment on it? And it kind of goes to the question of what the exemption is. If it's a disability and we can point to them not being able to do the essential functions of the job because of it, that's going to be very different, because then we can say, hey, listen, they couldn't do the essential functions. Religious, that's a little more difficult. In terms of constructive discharge, they've actually said it is not an adverse employment action to put an employee on an unpaid leave. Of course, my view, it's going to be a question of how long of an unpaid leave are we putting one on. If it's 2 months, in my mind, that'd get really, even a month would start getting close to being an adverse employment action, or at least a constructive discharge. So me and John will be around. If you have additional questions, we are available. You have our contact information there. Feel free to reach out to either of us on these questions. Or if there's a partner with SA, with SmithAmundsen that you deal with, give them a call. We are dealing with this on a regular basis. We know you are too. And I believe we have a short break before our next presentation.
Even shorter now, but thank you everyone for your time.